begin our Clean Air panel discussion this afternoon, please welcome Dr. Roger Porter.
Thank you very much, Fred, and it's a delight for us to join many in celebrating the 25th anniversary of the presidency of George H.W. Bush. As Fred has pointed out, this panel is going to focus on environmental policy and in particular the Clean Air Act. And I'm delighted to be joined by two people who played pivotal roles in the passage of that legislation, Bob Grady and Senator Alan Simpson. We're going to try to do three things in this panel. First, we're going to pose the question, did in fact the Clean Air Act in practice over the last 25 years fulfill the promise and intent of its creators? We often in public policy end up making claims about what will happen if we do X or Y. But it's instructive, among other things, to go back and look and see if the promises that were being made by its proponents actually occurred. We're secondly going to look at the way in which the Clean Air Act was fashioned within the executive branch and the proposal that was developed before President Bush sent it to Congress. And then third, we're going to look at how the legislation actually got passed, and in particular, we'll focus on the action in the Senate, which was decisive with respect to securing this legislation. So first, let us turn to Bob Grady, who was the chief speechwriter for President Bush during his 1988 campaign. Bob was the one who came up with the wonderful line, "The time for study has ended, the time for action has arrived." And once President Bush got elected, Bob served as the associate director at the Office of Management and Budget for natural resources, energy, and science, and played an absolutely pivotal role. I think it's fair to say Dick Darman effectively outsourced the environmental portfolio to Bob, and Bob is going to talk to us about how the act has in fact worked in practice.
I'd feel much more comfortable if I told people that my black socks are in my suitcase. I was just getting twitchy there. I heard someone. So, now I'm just relaxed and ready to go, Grady. All right.
Here we go. First, let me say what an honor it is not only to be on a panel with good friends like Dr. Porter and Senator Simpson, although I'm glad I'm going before Senator Simpson instead of afterwards. But as many other speakers said, it's such a privilege to be here at this reunion celebration, and I think I speak for a lot of us when I say that the privilege of serving in the administration of this not only wonderful president but great man was probably the greatest honor and one of the most fun experiences of my life. So, and he really. Now, to judge whether this Clean Air statute worked, I want to take you back in time and think back. You have to remember, in 1988, when George H.W. Bush ran for the presidency, the environment was a much bigger issue than it's been in a number of elections recently. Part of that was we were coming out of an era where we had discovered over 1,000 toxic waste Superfund sites around the country. Air pollution in the United States was actually terrible. We had in many cities, the smog in Los Angeles, in the city of Los Angeles, they exceeded the health-based standards for smog on 188 days of the year. In other words, half the days of the year in LA in 1988, it was unhealthy to go outside. Half the days of the year. Pollution was washing up on the shores of New Jersey and famously in Boston Harbor, topic to which I may return here. There was some argument about the health effects of acid rain, but there was no question that lakes in the Northeast were being denuded of fish, that forests in the Northeast in particular, and in high altitude up and down the East Coast were being denuded of trees. And people like Governor Sununu when he was governor of New Hampshire, and Senator Olympia Snowe, who's here, and importantly, her colleague from Maine, Senator George Mitchell, were very worried and very, very concerned about that. It was also a major irritant in our relations with Canada, because Canada was suffering from the effects of acid precipitation, and Prime Minister Mulroney, who was a very close friend of this president's, had written him, was giving a lot of speeches about it, talking about it quite a bit. So people were concerned. If you roll the clock forward today and think about it, one of the reasons that the environment really hasn't been quite as much of an issue in our presidential elections is that the environmental laws we've enacted in the last 45 years have actually worked very, very well. Very well. Our air and water are cleaner. Our oceans and rivers are safer and cleaner to swim in. Our landfills are safer. And we have the measurable health results to show that. So with that as context, let me just say, of all those laws, I believe there is a very, very strong case that the single most effective has been the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. I actually think it would be accurate to say that this is the most effective environmental statute ever enacted. Now, why do I say that? First of all, the law, Clean Air Act, is still on the books today and still working very well. 23 years later, it still has effect and remains the law of the land. But more importantly, the actual results of the statute have been staggeringly effective. So that what the Clean Air Act does is it regulates 6 so-called criteria air pollutants. Carbon monoxide, which comes out of cars. If you breathe it in your garage, you would die. Smog, lead, et cetera, and I'll go through them. But in the 23 years since this law was enacted, both the ambient concentrations of those pollutants, the amount that's just there in the air, and the annual amount that's emitted have been reduced very, very dramatically. So from 1990 to 2012, according to the US EPA, and people might not know this, but the EPA actually has monitors all around the country which monitor smog right here in College Station or in Houston and in cities and states all over the country. So they have monitors of all these pollutants. In that period, from 1990 to 2012, the ambient concentrations, the amount of carbon monoxide in the air in the United States is down by 75%. The amount of lead in the air is down by 87%. The amount of NOx, nitrogen oxide, which contributes to smog, is down by 50%. The amount of particulate matter, fine particulate matter, which does cause premature death, is down by 40%. The volatile organic compounds, O3, combined, the smog basically, down about 15% at ambient concentrations, but I'll go into how much it's been reduced. And sulfur dioxide, the cause of acid rain, down 72%. So if you just add all that up and think about it, our air today, right now, around you, has 67% fewer tons of pollutants floating around in it than it had 23 years ago because of this act. Now, that's of course for a simple reason. Annual emissions of all these things are down very sharply as well, by basically similar numbers. So again, if you take how much came out of every smokestack or automobile tailpipe or whatever in 1990 and measure it against 2012, carbon monoxide is down 65%, lead annual emissions down 80%, NOx down 52%, volatile organic compounds down 45%, particulate matter down 57%, and sulfur dioxide down 75%. So Americans today live in cities and states with much, much cleaner air. And let me give you sort of a practical explanation or flavor for what that means. I mentioned in 1988, the greater Los Angeles area was out of attainment with the ozone standard, with the health-based standards for smog, 188 days of the year. 188 days. In 2013, LA was out of attainment 25 days. Not far from here, in Houston, which was at that time the second worst city in terms of a smog problem in the country. In 1988, Houston was out of attainment with the smog standard, the ozone standard, 80 days. Last year, 10 days. Baltimore, another city which had a big problem. In 1988, out of attainment, 65 days. Last year, 4 days. And by the way, That is despite the fact, and Boyden would know this, who was also very involved in the Clean Air Act, that the EPA has actually moved the goalpost. In other words, the standard, the health-based standard for ozone non-attainment is tighter than it was. They actually made it about 30% more difficult to reach, and they tightened up the measurement period. So if they actually hadn't moved the goalpost, the non-attainment in Houston, Baltimore, and most cities in the country would have gone to zero. In other words, the standard that applied in 1988, you would have healthy air every day of the year. Now, this is really important. This took place in a time frame, of course, in which the U.S. economy, in the exact same period, is almost 3 times as big as it was in 1990, in just nominal terms. In other words, the U.S. economy was $6 trillion in 1990. It's $17 trillion today. And even if you adjust that for inflation, the economy's grown by 76% in real terms. Our population in that same time period is up 20%. The number of vehicle miles traveled in that same time period is up over 25%. So if you think about it, the economy's bigger, the population's bigger, people are driving more, but gross emissions are down, 65, 70% across the board. It's really quite remarkable. Now, in addition to those 6 criteria air pollutants, another thing that had never been regulated before and were a big air pollution problem is something called air toxics. So things like benzene, formaldehyde, arsenic. These were never actually controlled by the law because before, in 1970 and 1977, Congress passed a law and said you have to control these to an ample margin of safety. Well, the courts fought over what's an ample margin of safety, and a famous U.S. Court of Appeals decision written by, interestingly enough, the late Robert Bork, was that there is no ample margin of safety. The ample margin of safety is 0. So the EPA could never figure out how to regulate them. Okay, in 1990, we created a framework for regulating them using available technology, so-called RACT, and today EPA regulates a list of those 187 identifiable carcinogens, which were coming out of chromium plants or factories around the country, and emissions of those air toxics are down 72% of those 187 toxic chemicals. Now, one reason, of course, that all of that became possible, that we were able to reduce air toxics by 72%, reduce sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and have the economy have a boom period in the 1990s and in the 2000s, was because, unlike much of today's lawmaking, we took cost into account at President Bush's insistence. We were creative in terms of how to do things in the most cost-effective way, and to balance costs and benefits. So the most clear example of that was something Governor Sununu mentioned, the Clean Air Act's really signature program, which was the first ever national program to control acid rain, to control sulfur dioxide emissions, mainly from electric power plants. And I remember we went to the Domestic Policy Council in the Roosevelt Room, chaired by Dr. Roger Porter, and we presented President Bush early in 1989 with 3 options. We could reduce emissions from power plants by 4 million tons, and at the time there were about 25 million tons a year of power plant emissions. We could reduce by 8 million tons, we could reduce by 10 million tons. And the president actually picked the most ambitious target to cut it in half, cut it by 10 million tons. We were deathly afraid of the costs, frankly, and we studied at length these analyses from the consulting firm about where your costs would get out of control. But what we were able to do, of course, is to cut it in half because we had an innovative program to allow the trading of sulfur dioxide emissions allowances. So in other words, if a plant over-controlled by greater than the standard required, they could sell the excess emissions to another plant for whom it would be more expensive to install controls. That also, by the way, was the key to the political conundrum that Governor Sununu mentioned. It used to be, the reason there was no acid rain control program was that people who lived in states in the Midwest where they had power plants that were emitting a lot said, look, this is a national problem, we should have a national tax. People that lived on the coast said, well, wait a minute, we shouldn't pay a national tax. We have clean power plants, these people in the Midwest have dirty power plants, that's not fair. But the trading system was an ingenious way to solve that political conundrum, because what it basically said was people in the Midwest voluntarily opted to put on scrubbers and over control, and then they could sell those excess emissions allowances to the people on the coast that didn't have as big a problem but were still a little short of meeting the standard, and it was sort of a voluntary way of subsidizing putting those scrubbers on, but it wasn't a national tax, and it was the key to solving the political problem. Well, here are the results from that acid rain program. In 1990, there were 23 million tons of sulfur dioxide emissions in the United States. In 2012, there were 6 million. So we overachieved. We didn't get 10 million tons, we got 17 million tons. And in terms of cost, we actually did it at a much lower price. Our estimate at the time that we were debating this bill and enacting this bill is that it would cost about $700 a ton to reduce a ton of sulfur dioxide from power plants. And in fact, the electric utility said, no, it's going to be way more than that. It's going to be $1,500 a ton. We said, well, if it's that expensive, we'll set the penalties at $1,500, so just don't control, you can pay the penalty. Okay, with the emissions trading system, the average price of a traded ton of sulfur dioxide for 13 years was $125 a ton. And that's a perfect proxy for the marginal cost of control, right? So it was literally 1/5 the cost of what people expected at the time because of the trading system. Now, I will say that the trading system is now kind of frozen because of new cross-state air pollution rules, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. I'm not going to take the time to talk about it now. But I just want to say, if you take in total the measured benefits of this Clean Air Act versus the measured costs, and EPA is required to go out and do a study and measure these things. According to EPA's study, we can debate its believability, but I think it's a big, long volume. I read it prior to coming here. The benefits, the measured benefits of the Clean Air Act are 30 times the measured cost, 30 times. So in other words, we actually wrote into the law a requirement that you have to study every couple of years the benefits and costs of this statute. And EPA has come out with studies. The last one was in 2011. It's called the Prospectives Report. And they modeled that the annual cost of compliance is about $40 billion a year. Big number. Half of that is just changes to cars. It's in the price of your automobile. Half of it's in fuels. And about 20% of it's cost to electric utilities. But the annual benefits, as measured by EPA in 2010, were $1.25 trillion a year. So literally 30 times the cost. Biggest benefits were avoiding premature mortality from breathing in fine particles, and then lost work days from asthma and things like that. In fact, EPA estimated that there were 13 million fewer lost work days in 2010 alone than there would have been otherwise without this act. And of course, they project forward to 2020 and say, by then it'll be benefits of $2 trillion, costs of $65 billion. So still about a 30-to-1 ratio. Now, here's the thing. Not everything in this law came out exactly as we expected. In the case of electric utilities, we thought actually a lot of people would opt to put on scrubbers, et cetera. But one thing that happened is in Wyoming, in Senator Simpson's state, a second rail line was built into the Powder River Basin. And actually, a lot of people opted instead to just switch to low sulfur coal. And so the Clean Air Act has been a tremendous benefit for the state of Wyoming. And some electric utilities switched to natural gas as well. But the beauty of the act is because it embodied that concept of freedom of choice, in terms of how to comply, the utilities could simply innovate and find the way to comply that was cheapest for their ratepayers. So, in the end, if you look at this law, I think we can take sort of 3 lessons away from it. And perhaps these lessons are a gift from this president, from this great president, George H.W. Bush, to future lawmakers and presidents. The first is bipartisanship. It's been mentioned quite a bit. But people forget, you look at roll calls lately. This law passed the United States Senate by 89 to 11. I know that because I have the old paper roll call from the Senate clerk framed and hanging in my study at home in Jackson Hole. And it's signed by 3 people, Bob Dole, George Mitchell, and Senator Alan K. Simpson. And it passed the House by 401 to 21. And you sort of compare that to more recent statutes in the last year or two where one party sort of jams it down the throats of the other party with no consultation, and then they don't get any votes from the other party either. And that is why, even if some of those statutes pass, they won't stand the test of time for 25 years like this bill has. And I'll borrow a line from Senator Simpson that I've heard him say. It's like, if you don't believe in compromise, if you don't understand the word compromise, you probably shouldn't run for Congress. And whatever else, be damn sure you don't get married. Second lesson.
Do you still stand by that, Al?
Sorry, Ann.
60 years.
He said that when Ann wasn't here. No. Second lesson is cost effectiveness. As James Carville might say, the effect on the economy does matter. President Bush in this law was realistic and balanced. We explicitly took the concept of cost into account. And as Roger Porter will talk about, and Senator Simpson, we talked about the process. At one seminal moment, we sent a letter to the Hill saying we will not sign a bill, and it was a credible veto threat that has compliance costs of more than $20 billion a year in $1990, plus or minus 5%. So of course they went right to $21 billion. But if you look at the compliance cost today of $40 billion a year, that's about $20 billion of $1990. So the law is still holding to that cost cap we put in there. But that concept was something that allowed us to control emissions while still having the tremendous economic growth we had in the 20 years that followed the statute. And the last one, again, is leadership. And Roger will talk about this. It's been mentioned at some length today. But in this case, the president just didn't sort of articulate principles or go out and make a speech and say, I'm for clean air. We spent 6 months in a very detailed process with a lot of people involved and actually sent up, in June of 1989, a 420-page bill. And the net result of that is for the whole rest of the process, everybody was negotiating off of our piece of paper, off of George Bush's piece of paper. And so I think those are 3 key lessons. A final point. Clean air was really just one of a list of major environmental accomplishments by this president. He launched the cleanup of New York Harbor, the Jersey Shore, Baltimore, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Boston Harbor by building sewage treatment plants. I have to say one thing, I think my most favorite day of the entire 1988 campaign was the day we went up to Boston behind enemy lines and gave a speech about Boston Harbor and sailed around in a little boat. And Ron Kaufman, who's here, he put copies of the Boston Herald on the press bus on everybody's chair with a poll that day that said Dukakis and Bush were actually tied in Massachusetts at that point, late August of '88. And I remember the speech because before that, the president had been given a little bit of a hard time by the press because in some offhand comments, one time he asked for a splash of coffee, another time he did something wrong and he said, oh, I'm in deep doo-doo. So we put this line in the speech and I said, well, we did this calculation. We said if you took all the sludge that Governor Dukakis had dumped in Boston Harbor and spread it over the 43 towns that made up the Massachusetts Water Resources Development Authority, it would cover the 43 towns to a depth of 17 feet of sewage sludge. So the punchline of the speech was, talk about deep doo-doo. But to go down the list, he proclaimed no overall net loss of wetlands. Now, people said we were crazy at the time to do it, but here's an interesting thing. If you look at the National Wetlands Inventory for the first time in 2003, because of things enacted by this president, North American Waterfowl Plant, Swamp Buster, and the Farm Bill, creating a whole bunch of new wildlife refuges, the United States since 2003 has been a net gainer of wetlands, a net gainer. So and the United States was losing 500,000 acres a year of wetlands before that. So that actually came true. The president added dozens of, I think 57 in total, new wildlife refuges, hundreds of thousands, almost 1 million acres of national parks. Big explosion and expansion of parks, boat ramps, trails in the Forest Service. He launched an initiative that Roger spearheaded to plant 1 billion trees. He cleaned up the oil spill at Valdez, which happened right after he took office, and then immediately passed a statute to require double hulls in the bigger oil tankers. Promulgated a rule called Subtitle D, which made all the landfills in the country safer and revolutionized the landfill industry in the United States. And so on and so forth. Cleaned up a multi-decade mess at federal facilities. The point is this. In August of 1988, when the president, when George H.W. Bush, then vice president, was running for president, he went to Michigan, and he went to Boston Harbor, and he went to the Jersey Shore, went to the Delaware coast, and he promised all these things. He said he would do a Clean Air Act. He said he would do no net loss of wetlands. He said he would expand the parks. In short, what he said is, I will be the environmental president. And you look back today, I don't think he has gotten sufficient credit for it, in part because our politics have become so partisan, in part some of the interest groups have become so partisan. But by George, he made good on that promise.
Thank you very much, Bob. That reminds me of a poll that came out shortly after the Clean Air Act had been passed, where a group of environmental organizations gave grades to the president. And there were very few high grades, a couple of Bs and some Cs. it was very disappointing after having passed the most significant piece of environmental legislation in our history. And I remember walking in one morning, I think it was with Governor Sununu, in the Oval Office, and the president looked up and said, "Did you read this morning's paper?" And I said, "Are you referring to the report card that you received?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, what did you think?" And he said, "Well, I'm not going to send it home." And I said, "You know, Mr. President, I know you don't agree with the report card, and neither do we, but that's not why you did it. You did it because it was the right thing to do, and there will be other report cards later, and my guess is they will be much better." And as Bob has pointed out, those report cards now, 25 years later, are coming in, and it's a very impressive record indeed. Now, the question is, how did this happen? When presidents come into office, they have to make a set of decisions about people and about processes and about priorities. And I think it's very interesting that when President Bush came in, he appointed Bill Riley as administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, someone who had a great deal of credibility and goodwill with the environmental community and was a very strong administrator. He appointed James Watkins, Admiral Watkins, as Secretary of Energy, someone who had a lot of credibility and stature in the energy field. He appointed as his White House Chief of Staff, Governor Sununu, who had a great deal of experience and expertise and knowledge and understanding about environmental issues. He appointed as his White House counsel Boyd and Gray, who similarly had a real passion for and a lot of knowledge and interest and expertise on environmental issues. And I served as his assistant for economic and domestic policy. He had people like Bob Grady at the Office of Management and Budget, and Dick Schmalzi and Michael Boskin at the Council of Economic Advisors. So he assembled a group of people who had differing viewpoints, to be sure, but a lot of passion and interest on this issue. Secondly, he decided that the way in which he was going to go about making decisions was through a process which has become known as multiple advocacy. And that is a process in which the White House engages with departments and agencies in a very open and transparent process, so that the president is presented, as Bob pointed out, with a series of options that reflect a great deal of expertise that has been assembled from all across the administration so that he can make an informed decision. And thirdly, presidents have to worry about priorities. And when President Bush came in, it's worth noting that if you look at the presidents, the last 13 presidents we've had, the modern presidency since Franklin Roosevelt, 9 of them came into office with majorities of their own party in both houses of Congress. One of them, Ronald Reagan, came into office with a Republican majority in the Senate, but a Democratic majority in the House. And only 3 presidents, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and George H.W. Bush, came into office with opposition majorities in both houses. And of those 3, the one with the largest opposition majorities of any president in U.S. history was George H.W. Bush. So he had to decide when he came in, how am I going to try to provide leadership in a situation in which I'm going to be dealing with a Congress that has large opposition majorities. And so when in his very first address to a joint session of Congress on February 9th of 1989, he announced that a series of priorities and proposals that he would be making, including one to deal with a comprehensive Clean Air Act. This was an indication on his part that he was prepared to spend the political capital that he had on an issue in which it had effectively been gridlocked, as Governor Sununu had pointed out in an earlier panel, for the previous 13 years. It reflected a very courageous decision on his part. And in developing the 400-plus page proposal that was advanced, we ended up engaging in a process that included all the departments and agencies, but also involved, thanks to the good offices of people like Fred McClure, who helped to arrange these meetings, over 20 meetings with Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, in advance of the President's decision, engaging them and asking them what they thought ought to be in the bill and what their biggest objectives were and what their biggest concerns were. We similarly met with more than 24 outside groups, environmental, agricultural, industrial, to get their ideas. So that when the President had to make the choice that he did about what he was going to advance in this proposal, he had, in fact, a good amount of information available to him as to where those in the Congress were coming from and where those in organized interest groups were coming from. Now, he makes this proposal. And he asked me to go up and talk to John Dingell, who was chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where it would go there, and to Senator Mitchell, who was effectively, Quentin Burdick was the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, but this was a big passion of Senator Mitchell, and see what their view was. John Dingell said, appreciate it coming up, but we're not even going to hold hearings on it. I said, what's the problem? He said, look, this is going to be a highly contentious issue in the House. And I'm not going to have a bloodbath over this because you're never going to get it through the Senate. And he frequently referred to me, which I treasure, young man. He said, young man, you don't realize you have to get 60 votes for anything in the Senate. And you won't be able to get 60 votes in the Senate to pass it. People have been trying for over a dozen years, and it won't happen. I said to him, well, the President's going to ask what the result of this conversation is. If we get a bill out of the Senate, will you agree to bring a bill out of your committee to the floor of the House and get a bill passed on the House so that we can take it to conference? And he said, you won't get it out of the Senate, but if you do, I will agree to that. And sure enough, he did. So that raises the question, how did we get it through the Senate? Because when the bill went up, we had costed out the bill at $19 billion a year. And the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, on which Senator Simpson sat, produced its own bill, which it costed out at $42 billion a year. We're at 19, they're at 42. Now, our bill only got 99% of the benefits that their bill did. They were virtually identical in terms of the environmental benefits. And so then something very interesting happened. Senator Mitchell, who would like to have been with us today, and let me share with you a letter that he wrote, because we invited him to be here on this panel. Dear Roger, thank you for inviting me to the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the presidency of George H.W. Bush. I'm honored by the invitation and regret very much that I am not able to attend. Unfortunately, I have a long-standing business commitment in Europe on April 5th through 7th. I especially regret missing the discussion of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Looking back, it was a good example of bipartisan cooperation on legislation dealing with an important national problem. Critical to the outcome was the decision of President George H.W. Bush to support clean air legislation. Within a month of his inauguration, in a break with the policies of the prior administration, President Bush announced that he would propose legislation for new, more effective Clean Air Act, including action on acid rain. President Bush's courageous decision made action on clean air legislation possible. Suddenly, dramatically, the question shifted from will there be a Clean Air Act to what will be in the Clean Air Act. I was impressed and heartened by the President's statement. Although none of us could have known it at the time, there began a process that lasted nearly 2 years. As you know, there were many ups and downs, many struggles and setbacks, but it finally came together and culminated in the enactment of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. And then he quotes the National Resources Defense Council, one of our leading environmental organizations. The Clean Air Act is a genuine American success story and one of the most effective tools in U.S. history for protecting public health. The NRDC estimated, among many other health benefits, that the 1990 amendments saved nearly 2 million lives. For that outcome, President Bush deserves great credit. Please extend to him and your many guests my sincere regret that I'm not able to be there for this important and well-deserved celebration. With my best regards, George J. Mitchell. Now, at the heart of what went on in the Senate was Alan Simpson. At the time, this is true, at the time, Alan Simpson served as the Republican whip, which is the number 2 position in the Republican leadership in the Senate. George Mitchell was the majority leader, Bob Dole was the minority leader, and Alan Simpson was his right-hand person. And George Mitchell went to Bob Dole and said, will you join me in going to the President with a proposal? I'm not going to bring the administration's bill to the floor, and if I bring the Environment and Public Works Committee bill to the floor, it can't get 60 votes. So what we would like to propose to the President is a negotiation to produce an administration leadership agreement. You, Bob Dole, will produce a majority of Republicans. I, George Mitchell, will produce a majority of Democrats, and the President will agree to it in this tripart negotiation. And the President agreed, and so for a little over 130 hours, over the next month, that very long month in March of 1990, we negotiated in the conference room there, the Majority Leader's conference room, S224. And I thought it would be great to have Senator Simpson share with us some of his recollections of both the negotiations that occurred and then what happened when the bill got out on the floor and the flurry of amendments descended.
Well, first you can see how it passed with this technician over here and this skillful Socratic professor over here. And we just blundered around in it. But first of all, I want to say it is a joy to be here for me and for Ann. We first met George and Barbara, not Barbara, but George in 1962. That goes back a ways. His father had just left the U.S. Senate, Prescott Bush, and my father had just been elected to the U.S. Senate. And Dad took over Prescott Bush's office. And so I met George Bush. He was out there helping the old man fill up boxes or something. And then when Dad left the Senate 4 years later because of his health, they sold their home to a nice young congressman and his wife from Texas, Barbara and George. And so it goes way back, and it's been an absolute joy. We've fished in Glacier, we've done trips, we've hunted, we've legislated, we've laughed. For a guy who loves jokes and good humor, the only thing about George is he can never remember a punchline. Even if he just heard the joke, an hour before. He's not here. He knew I'd say something like that. We've thrown snowballs off the roof of the White House. That was a great night, Barbara. Remember that? She said, "God, look at this! Look at the snow out there. The way." We said, "Let's go throw snowballs," which we did. Yeah, you did things which were light and loving and fun because politics is barbaric. He never let it be barbaric because his slogan is right on everything he's ever done. What would he do without family and friends? That's the essence of the man. But nevertheless, he's the most decent man I have ever known, and he is always there to pick up a wounded warrior. Rostenkowski was mentioned here by John or someone. Rossi went to the pen. And it was a sad thing, but the first guy that contacted him in the pen was George. Anytime somebody, the reason it passed is because he knew all the guys he worked with in the house, they loved him. Because he knew Sonny Montgomery, and he knew these guys, he knew David, he knew these people. And it's not a government of men and not laws, or laws and not men. It's a government of men and women who know the law and try to make it work. But anyway, I'll never forget how I think I was at the population or popularity rating of 3%. I'd been doing a labor for him with Bork and Thomas, and these were cheerful work that I was out there doing. Getting chopped to bits by every group in America. He's at 93%. I get a call, 6 o'clock one morning. I never get up at 6. He gets up, listens to country music at 5, I think, or 5:30, whatever. He said, "Hey, read the Washington Post today, Al?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, they nailed you again." I said, "Well, that's good of you to call, George." And then he said, "How'd you like to go to Camp David for a couple days? Just you and Ann, Barbara." I said, "Well, that's great." I knew what he was doing. He said, "Come over to the White House first." And then he's signing something with his loopy left hand, scribbling all over this stuff. And I said, "Look, I'll come out under a blanket and get into the aircraft." He said, "No, you won't. Barbara and Ann will go out there, and then I'm going to go out. You're going to walk, and you're going to wave to all your pals in the press that have been chopping you to bits." I said, "Oh, this is good." Put his arm around me, got on the chopper, and we had a wonderful time. Won't go into all that because it won't take this long, I promise. But the next morning he's going through all the papers, which he did, and then he watched 5 television sets at once. I said, "Why don't you, oh God, look at that." I said, "Turn it off, for God's sake. You get gas, ulcers, and heartburn looking at this stuff." So anyway, there he said, "I've got the picture." New York Times front page says, "Senator and Mrs. Al Simpson joining the Bushes at Camp David." And here he is, he's got his arm around me, which he did just to be sure. Well, anyway, we're sitting in the sweat up there, just laughing and telling stories. And I said, "I know what you're doing here. You're picking up your wounded duck friend and putting me back together." He said, "Yeah, now let's talk about something else." That's George Bush. That's who he is. Now, George Mitchell, a magnificent man. I was the assistant leader for Bob Dole for 10 years. My colleagues as assistant were Al Cranston and Wendell Ford. Were we supposed to get together? We did. People come up to me today and said, "You're Al Cranston." I said, "No, no." He looked like me, but and the same first name. But that really happens to me. It's not funny, but Cranston was a good egg, and Wendell. But George Mitchell sat in that room, and then my job was to go around to my people as whip, and I'd say, "Is there anything about what they're working on in there that gives you heartburn?" "Well, yeah, what are they doing in there?" "They're working on the Clean Air Act." "Well, wait a minute, I said, "Then you're going to go into that room and you're going to tell what's your little pain." Well, then I round them up. You have any bitches about the Clean Air Act?" "No, I don't." "Well, then you don't need to go to this room, but if you do, then you need to go to this room." And here in the room was Quentin Burdick, Moynihan, Chafee, good people of both parties, and George patiently coming out of his majority office to join at the table. Well, Metzenbaum and I did not have a loving relationship, but we did get there. And when I taught at Harvard, he came out there and brought his grandson, and we told about how the two of us used to tear each other to shreds. And that's another story. But Metzenbaum had put an amendment in that all coal had to be reduced by 15% of its carbon, of its high sulfur. Well, Wyoming was already below that. I said, "What the hell is this percentage reduction when we're already lower than where you can ever get it?" Well, he said, "That's what we're doing." I said, "I know what you're doing, but you ain't doing it to me out in Wyoming." So Metz and I got in the room, and Metzenbaum said, "Well, what can we do here?" I said, "Well, you can get off my back, and I'll get off yours on some other bill." I can't remember what it was. But anyway, old Metz made his deal, and it was well received. Chafee and Mitchell worked together beautifully, and we worked till 1 or 2 or 3 in the morning. And I came out one morning at 2 out of that meeting, and here was a bunch of greenies that were just beyond green. They had turned into sludge. And I said, "What are you guys doing out here? You look like you're all worked up." And they said, "We're trying to figure out how to beat Mitchell and Chafee in the next election." I said, "You guys need an injection of something. Go home and go haunt someone else." Well, anyway, from that came the bill. The bill came to the Senate, and Byrd had come. George said, "We can't go anywhere without Byrd." I mean, Byrd had a stamp on his head which said, "High sulfur coal above God." and it was emblazoned. It was like Harry Potter with. But Byrd came in, and George said, "You know, Robert," no one called him Bob, "Robert, this is it. This is the serious business." He said, "I know, and it's very grievous to me, but we all sat maybe for half a day with Robert, but you can't put in an amendment about high sulfur coal that would be the end of the bill." "Well, I know it will, and I don't want that to happen, but I just will have to reserve my option, but I won't do anything destructive." And we just kept moving him, but it wasn't getting anywhere at all. And finally we had to go to the floor, and we were doing pretty well, and in came the Byrd Amendment. It was best known as a blaster. It was a camp clearer. It was a personnel grenade. And he just got out there and did it. Well, the debate went on, Dole and I and George, all of us just in shock. And don't forget, Byrd had awesome powers, and he had lined up those guys for weeks saying, "There's going to come an amendment, and I'll need you. And you know what I have in the Appropriations Committee? I have 13 earmarks of yours just waiting there to be dealt with." And they will be dealt with, and you know that. Well, anyway, Joe Biden, this is it. I'll never forget it. Joe, the reason I love Joe and I do, 45 years worth, is that he gets his foot in his mouth as much as I do. So Joe gave the most powerful talk about this amendment, and then I think Boren got up, wasn't he on our side? I can't remember, and he said, well, I'll tell you, if this amendment goes in, George Bush will veto this bill. Now, you heard one of those stories moments ago. And Joe said, now, I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all, just like Foley telling you. He said, that's just not true. You can't let something go like that when it's a signature piece. And it was a beautiful thing, as Joe said it, and he went back into the cloakroom, and I called Bush. I said, George, he's in the cloakroom. Call him and tell him you'll veto the bill without question if this amendment goes through. So I looked through and George was right there. I tell you, he couldn't have been a second after it's Joe Biden, the president, like speak to. And I heard Joe say, what? Well, you really mean that, Mr. President? He said, well, anyway, I could see that the hook was set. And so Joe came back out after a while of other debate going, and he said, I have been personally advised by the President of the United States that he would indeed veto this powerfully important bill if this amendment by my friend Robert Byrd should pass. He said, this causes me tremendous pain. He said, but under that circumstances and knowing this president as I have come to do, I know that he will veto this bill. And therefore, I will have to vote against the Byrd amendment. Well, Byrd, it was very special to see. But anyway, the Byrd amendment went down by one vote because Bennett Johnson, who would have been shattered again, he went to a funeral of
a friend of his had a funeral.
And so Bennett would have had to vote with Byrd because Byrd had been working him over for 6 months. And he was gone, and it went down by one. And we skipped it through with the voting you've heard. But the final one that my pals have never heard is that apparently, according to Paul Sarbanes, who was a dear friend of the other faith, I saw him about 8 or 10 years ago, and he said that one day in the Democrat caucus of the Senate, that Biden gave the most strident talk about sticking with your position. Stick with the caucus, or when you make a pledge, you do this. And I guess it was just marvelous. And Sarbanes said that as he finished, Byrd rose with his finger, said, Senator Biden, may I refresh your memory? and I mean, that was part of the game. But anyway, it was a great honor and a privilege to do it. And when the thing passed, George and I were fishing in Jackson. And George P. was with us. Little George P. was only 12. And Riley calls, it was in the summer, he said it passed the Senate. So, or the House, I can't remember, but anyway, it was a joyous time. But let me give you just the definition of politics, and then you'll know everything will be solved. It takes 10 seconds. In politics, there are no right answers. Only a continual flow of compromises among groups resulting in a changing, cloudy, and ambiguous series of public decisions where appetite and ambition compete openly with knowledge and wisdom. So, that's it.
Please join me in thanking Alan and Bob.
Is that it?
Gentlemen, thank you so very, very much. Let's give them another round of applause.